Michael, a sales representative accustomed to long night drives, began yet another lonely journey towards a distant city. The road in front of him was a narrow strip of asphalt that cut through a dense forest, disappearing into the darkness. The night was particularly cold, and a thick fog spread across the road, restricting his vision to just a few meters ahead. The silence was absolute, interrupted only by the gentle rumble of the engine and the occasional sound of dry leaves being dragged by the wind. As he drove on, the headlight of Michael's car briefly illuminated the tall, dark trees that flanked the road, revealing shadows that seemed to move and squirm at the edges of his peripheral vision. He adjusted the rearview mirror, trying to dispel the feeling of isolation that enveloped him. For a moment, he allowed himself to think that he was completely alone on that stretch of road, surrounded only by the vastness of the forest and the mist that closed in around him. It was then that he noticed something strange. A pair of headlights suddenly appeared in his rearview mirror, cutting through the darkness behind him. The car was following him closely, the light from the headlights reflecting intensely in its mirrors, almost blinding him for a few moments. Michael frowned, surprised by the proximity of the vehicle. The road was deserted as far as he could remember, and he hadn't seen another car since he had left the last town behind. At first, he tried to ignore the car, thinking that perhaps it was just another driver in a hurry to get to his destination. However, the uncomfortable feeling of being watched began to grow inside him, a feeling that was hard to ignore. Why would someone be driving so close at this time of night in such an isolated place? He increased his speed a little, hoping that the other driver would pass and continue on his way. However, the car behind Michael didn't back off, keeping dangerously close as if waiting for something or someone. Michael's unease turned into a twinge of worry. He knew something wasn't right, but he couldn't discern what it was. All he could do was keep driving, hoping that the stranger in the car behind him was nothing more than a hurried commuter. However, the weight of that presence in his rearview mirror made it difficult to remain calm, and he felt a chill run down his spine as the dark night seemed to become even more oppressive around him. As Michael drove along the winding road, the tension inside the car began to grow. The vehicle behind him continued to follow closely, its headlights still intensely focused on Michael's car, almost as if it wanted to force him out of the way. Michael tried to stay calm, telling himself that he was just an impatient driver, but the feeling of being hunted refused to go away. The silence around him made the situation even more surreal. The only thing Michael could hear was the hum of the engine and the constant crackle of leaves under the tires. He shifted his gaze to the rearview mirror again, expecting to see the car pulling away, but instead, the pursuer flashed his headlights, once, then again, blinding his eyes with the intensity of the lights. Michael's heart began to beat faster. Why would someone do that? Was it a provocation or a threat? Anxiety began to take hold of him, and he decided to speed up, trying to put distance between himself and the car. The road, however, was narrow and full of sharp bends, making it difficult to drive at high speed. Despite his efforts, the car behind him remained glued to him, like an implacable shadow that couldn't be shaken off. Every time he looked in the rearview mirror, he saw those headlights shining, almost as if they were glued to him. Michael began to think about his options. He could try to pull off the road and look for a place to hide, but with the thick fog and the darkness, the idea of driving off the road seemed dangerous. He could stop and confront the driver, but what if this stranger had dark intentions? The very thought made him grip the steering wheel tighter, his fingers white with tension. Finally, after what seemed like hours of relentless pursuit, Michael spotted a small gas station on the side of the road. The dim lights of the sign glowed in the mist, looking almost inviting in contrast to the oppressive darkness around him. He made a quick decision and turned the wheel, entering the station with a jerky movement. The car braked with a creak, and Michael parked near the convenience store, waiting for the other driver to drive straight past. To his dismay, the pursuing car also pulled into the station, stopping a few meters away. Michael watched through the rearview mirror as the other car's engine remained running, but the driver didn't get out. The figure behind the wheel was hidden in the darkness, but Michael could sense that he was being watched. His heart was pounding wildly as he tried to decide what to do. Every second seemed to drag by, the silence inside the car amplifying his fear. He knew he couldn't stay there forever. Taking a deep breath, Michael opened the car door and got out, trying to appear calm and indifferent. He took a few steps towards the convenience store, his eyes constantly straying to the car parked behind him. Upon entering the store, Michael found a bright but empty environment, except for the clerk, who was sitting behind the counter, distracted by a TV program. The security offered by the store's walls was tenuous, and Michael couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. He bought a coffee, trying to calm his nerves, and looked out of the window. The other car was still there, and this time he saw the driver. A tall, thin figure got out of the car and stood next to the vehicle, watching Michael with a disturbing intensity. Even from a distance, Michael could feel the man's eyes on him, cold and emotionless. That look filled him with a fear he couldn't explain, a feeling that he was being hunted by something he didn't understand. Not wanting to prolong his stay, Michael paid for his coffee and went back to his car, trying to ignore the stranger. He knew he needed to get out of there as quickly as possible, but as he started the engine and pulled back onto the road, he couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror. The stalker was back in the car, and as soon as Michael pulled away from the post, the other vehicle also began to move, following him once again, even closer than before. Back on the road, Michael felt the weight of the car's presence behind him, now even closer and more threatening. Every time he looked in the rearview mirror, the intense glare of the pursuer's headlights seemed almost to devour him, as if the lights were trying to penetrate his mind, suffocating any hope of escaping that distressing situation. The panic, previously controlled, began to turn into despair. Michael gripped the steering wheel so hard that his fingers ached, while the silence around him became unbearable, only interrupted by the muffled sound of tires on asphalt. What had once been an ordinary road now seemed like an endless tunnel, shrouded in an increasingly oppressive darkness. The trees beside the road formed ghostly silhouettes in the fog, and the moon could barely penetrate the dense blanket. While he was trying to think of a way to get rid of his pursuer, his cell phone, until then forgotten on the passenger seat, began to ring, breaking the silence. Michael grabbed the device with a quick movement, hoping that it was someone he could talk to, someone who could help him get out of the situation. However, the screen showed an unknown number. For a brief moment, he hesitated, but curiosity and the fear of overlooking something important made him pick up. "Hello?" he said, his voice shaking slightly. On the other end of the line, there was no immediate response, just a disturbing silence, as if the person was listening but had no intention of speaking. Michael felt a shiver run down his spine, and he almost hung up the phone. But then a voice finally came through, distorted and muffled, as if it were being transmitted by an old radio. "You shouldn't have left that town." The voice was almost inhuman, as if each word was dragged out with effort by something it wasn't used to speaking. Michael froze, his heart racing, trying to understand what that message meant. Which city? Why shouldn't he have left? The questions went round and round in his mind, but he couldn't formulate a coherent answer. "Who are you? What do you want?" he finally managed to ask, his voice now filled with despair. The line went silent for a few moments, and then the same voice answered, now with an even more threatening tone. "You made a choice, and now there's no going back." Before Michael could say anything else, the call dropped. He stared at the phone for a few seconds, trying to process what had just happened. But before he could make any move, he realized that the car behind him had started to come even closer, almost touching his rear bumper. Panic began to overwhelm him. Without thinking, Michael hit the gas, trying to gain some distance, but the winding, narrow road made any attempt to escape difficult. The sharp bends hidden by the fog forced him to slow down constantly, and each time he did, the pursuing car came even closer. He could feel the ominous presence of the other vehicle, as if he were being pushed off the road, forced to follow a path he hadn't chosen. Every second seemed to stretch into hours as the road unraveled ahead endlessly. Michael tried to keep control, but fear and tension made it increasingly difficult. The car behind him showed no sign of backing off, and the feeling of being trapped grew. The road, which had once been a means of reaching his destination, was now turning into a trap, leading him to an unknown and possibly deadly destination. Despair began to give way to a feeling of helplessness. There was no one he could turn to for help, no safe place he could run to. He was alone, trapped in a hellish chase, with an invisible enemy who seemed to know more about him than he did. Then, as the bends in the road became even more treacherous, Michael began to wonder if he really knew that road, or if he was being led somewhere specific, where his pursuer would finally catch up with him. The darkness seemed to close in around him, and for the first time, he felt that perhaps there was no way out. The road that was supposed to take him to a safe destination was now full of uncertainty and danger, and Michael began to realize that no matter how fast he sped up, he couldn't escape what awaited him in the darkness. Michael's car snaked along the narrow, winding road, the speedometer marking a speed far above what he would consider safe under normal circumstances. But this was no normal night. The pursuer was so close now that the headlights reflected directly in the side mirrors, creating a disturbing halo around Michael's car. He felt like he was being pushed to a limit, forced to make hasty decisions in a game he didn't know how to play. As he tried to concentrate on the road ahead, Michael's cell phone rang again, this time with a louder, more insistent sound, as if it were vibrating directly on his nerves. His heart leapt. He knew he shouldn't answer it, but the urge to find out what was going on was irresistible. Still driving, he grabbed his cell phone from the passenger seat and saw the same unknown number flashing on the screen. With a trembling hand, he answered. "Hello?" he said, his voice almost lost in the noise of the engine. The answer came almost immediately, but it wasn't the same distorted voice he'd heard before. This time, it was a whisper, muffled and almost imperceptible, as if someone was speaking from the bottom of a well. "You made a choice, Michael. Now you have to deal with the consequences." Michael felt a shiver run down his spine. "What choice? Who are you?" he asked, his voice betraying the fear that consumed him. He wanted answers, but the truth was that he was afraid of what he might discover. The voice on the other end of the line laughed, a low, dry sound that reverberated in Michael's ears like the scratching of fingernails on a rough surface. "You really don't remember, do you? You don't remember what you did, what you left behind." Michael remained silent, trying to understand the meaning of those words. What could he have done? He was just an ordinary man, a sales rep, with nothing in his life to justify such persecution. But the feeling that something was terribly wrong began to seep into his mind like a slowly spreading poison. No matter how hard you try to run away, Michael, the road is long, but it always leads to the same place. You can't escape what's waiting for you. Michael wanted to shout, to demand answers, but the line went silent. The call had ended, leaving him alone with his disturbing thoughts. He glanced quickly at his cell phone, hoping to find some clue, but all he saw was the unknown number, like a silent reminder that the darkness around him was real, tangible. Desperate, Michael tried to concentrate on the road, but his mind was in turmoil. The words of the mysterious voice echoed in his head, turning over memories he didn't even know he had. Every bend in the road seemed like a new test, every kilometer an extension of his torment. He was trapped in a nightmare, a labyrinth of fear and paranoia from which he could not escape. The road, which had once been a mere path to his destination, now seemed like a nightmarish corridor leading inexorably towards something dark. At every turn, he felt as if he was being led deeper into a place where reality was distorted, where time and space didn't follow the normal rules. Michael knew he had to do something, but what? He was isolated, with no one to turn to, and the car behind him stood firm, like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. The feeling of helplessness grew, and he began to question his own sanity. Perhaps he was imagining it all. Maybe it was just a delirium caused by tiredness and tension, but the feeling that he was being guided, manipulated, was too strong to ignore. What had he forgotten? What had he done that put him in this situation? Every thought seemed to lead to a dead end, every question only adding to his confusion. Michael took a deep breath, trying to keep control. He needed to find out what was going on before it was too late. But the road ahead was uncertain, and what awaited him in the darkness was beyond anything he could imagine. Meanwhile, the car behind him continued to follow him, a constant and threatening presence, forcing him to continue in the direction that he knew would eventually lead him to face the fate he was desperately trying to avoid. Michael had already been on the road for hours, or so it seemed. Each kilometer traveled became a torturous repetition of the previous one. The road, once familiar, was now an endless labyrinth of curves and straights, shrouded in the same dense fog and oppressive darkness. The feeling of déjà vu grew by the minute, and the fear began to give way to a strange resignation, as if he were doomed to drive forever without ever getting anywhere. He tried to concentrate, to stay focused, but tiredness and mental strain were beginning to take their toll. His eyes burned, and every blink seemed like a monumental effort to keep the road in view. The darkness around him seemed to be closing in, compressing the space around him, making the world smaller and smaller, more suffocating. The car behind Michael, always present, continued to follow him with relentless precision, as if it knew exactly where he was going, or worse, where he should be going. Michael tried several times to throw off his pursuer, accelerating suddenly, braking sharply, even making unexpected turns, but nothing seemed to work. No matter what he did, the other car remained glued to him, like a shadow he couldn't shake off. In a moment of desperation, Michael decided to try something he had been avoiding all along. He made a sharp left turn off the main road and onto a narrow path that seemed to lead deep into the forest. The branches of the trees hit the car, scratching the paintwork and creating a disturbing sound, but he didn't care. All he wanted was to get rid of his pursuer. For a few moments, the plan seemed to be working. The other car was no longer visible, and the road ahead looked different, as if he was finally getting away. But the hope was short-lived. When the trail reconnected with the main road, Michael's heart sank. He was back at the same point as before, as if he had gone completely round the bend. And to make matters worse, the pursuer's headlights appeared again in the rearview mirror, relentless as ever. Despair gripped him. It was as if he were trapped in an infinite loop, condemned to repeat the same route, with no chance of escape. The road, which was supposed to lead to a destination, now seemed like a trap, closing around him like a noose. Every attempt to escape, every effort to change course, ended up taking him back to where he started. As he drove, Michael began to wonder if there really was a way out. Perhaps that road was the final destination, a purgatory from which there was no escape. The feeling that he was being guided, manipulated by forces beyond his comprehension, grew with every moment. He didn't know who was after him, but he was beginning to understand that it wasn't just a stalker. There was something else, something he couldn't see, but which was present, controlling his every move. The weight of this realization began to affect his sanity. He was tired, exhausted, and the thought of continuing to drive endlessly without ever finding an end was unbearable. Exhaustion mixed with fear, and Michael felt he was on the verge of collapse. Then something different happened. As he turned a corner, He saw a point of light in the distance. It was faint, almost indistinct, but it was there, shining through the mist. Michael felt a mixture of relief and suspicion. Was that the end of the road? Or just another trick, an illusion designed to keep him trapped? Heart pounding, he decided to head towards the light. Perhaps it was a way out, a hope in the midst of the chaos that surrounded him. But deep down, he knew that no matter what it was, he was being led there, drawn like a moth to the flame. The pursuer continued behind him, silent and constant, pushing him further and further into the unknown. The light ahead grew brighter and brighter, and the road began to change, becoming less familiar, more distorted. Michael knew he was approaching something, but what exactly, he didn't know. All he could do was keep going, hoping that at the end of this insane journey, he would find the answers he was looking for, or perhaps something even more terrifying. As he went on, Michael realized that there was no turning back. He was committed to this path, and the only way out would be to follow it to the end, regardless of what awaited him in the darkness. Michael advanced along the road, increasingly aware that he was approaching something definitive. The light ahead, once a distant and uncertain point, now shone with an almost supernatural intensity, like a beacon guiding him towards what seemed to be the climax of his journey. But along with the light, the road also began to change in a disturbing way. The asphalt, once regular and predictable, began to show cracks and potholes, as if the road itself was disintegrating as he approached his destination. The bends became tighter, forcing Michael to slow down, which only served to increase his anxiety. Each time he slowed down, the pursuer's headlights shone more brightly in the rearview mirror, reminding him that there was no escape. The light ahead finally revealed its origin, a sharp bend that descended towards a cliff. Michael felt his heart racing as he approached the critical point. There was no turning back, and the only choice left was to keep going and face whatever was waiting for him. The corner came faster than he expected. Michael tried to brake, but the tires skidded on the uneven asphalt, and the car lost control, spinning violently before veering off the road and coming to a dangerous stop near the edge of the cliff. The engine died with a final gasp, and for a moment the world fell silent. Michael was breathing heavily, his heart pounding uncontrollably in his chest as he stared at the precipice in front of him. He was on the edge of the abyss, literally and figuratively. But the silence was short-lived. The sound of the pursuer's engine cut through the air, and Michael knew that the man was getting closer. The pursuing car stopped a few meters away, its headlights still on, illuminating the scene with a ghostly light. Michael, still trapped in the driver's seat, tried to move, but the impact of the crash left him dazed and sore. His mind was racing, desperately trying to understand what was happening, but the answers remained out of reach. He watched, with a mixture of fear and resignation, as the door of the pursuing car slowly opened. A tall, thin figure emerged from the darkness, moving with disturbing calm towards him. The mist enveloped the man like a cloak, distorting his silhouette, but Michael could see his black boots tapping against the uneven ground, each step echoing like the sound of a hammer on the last nail of a coffin. Michael tried to move again, but the seatbelt seemed stuck, and his limbs didn't respond as they should. He was trapped, powerless, as the pursuer drew ever closer. The figure stopped beside the driver's door, standing for a moment in absolute silence, as if savoring the moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, the man leaned towards the broken window. Michael was finally able to see his pursuer's face, illuminated by the headlights. His wide eyes were filled with recognition. It was someone he knew, someone he should remember, but the memories were jumbled, confused, as if they had been deliberately erased or distorted. The man smiled, but the smile was not one of joy or sympathy. It was cold, emotionless, like the smile of someone who had already done his duty. He leaned even closer until his face was inches from Michael's, and then he whispered, You should never have left that place. And now, it's too late." Those words, spoken in such a low, threatening tone, shattered Michael's last shred of control. He felt a wave of panic and despair sweep through his body, but there was nothing more he could do. He was trapped, both physically and mentally, and the only thing left to do was wait for the inevitable. His pursuer opened the car door with a strong jerk, and Michael finally managed to move, but it was too late. The man grabbed him by the collar of his shirt, pulling him hard out of the vehicle. Michael tried to resist, but his strength was exhausted, and he was dragged to the edge of the cliff, where the man let go of him, dropping him to his knees at the edge of the abyss. The mist was closing in around them, and Michael looked at the man, still trying to find some logic, some explanation for what was happening. But all he saw was the impassive face of someone who had already decided his fate. The stalker looked down at the cliff and then back up at Michael, as if considering his options. Then, with a final gesture, he pointed to the darkness below and said, "This is the end of the road for you, Michael." The man's voice was the last thing Michael heard before everything went out. The darkness engulfed Michael completely, and for an instant he felt as if he were floating in a void, with no sense of time or space. The silence was absolute, overwhelming, as if the world itself had ceased to exist. But little by little, his consciousness began to return, bringing with it a deafening pain and growing confusion. He didn't know where he was, or how he had gotten there. All he knew was that he was no longer on the edge of the cliff. When he finally opened his eyes, Michael found himself lying on a cold, damp surface. Above him, the sky was covered in heavy, dark clouds, and the mist still enveloped him, although less dense than before. His chin and hands were scratched, and his every movement was accompanied by a sharp pain in his muscles and joints. He struggled to get up, his knees shaking as he tried to get his bearings. He was in a different but vaguely familiar place. All around, the landscape was desolate, with twisted, dead trees punctuating the horizon, as if the environment itself was doomed. In front of him, Michael saw something that made his heart stop for a moment. An old gas station, abandoned, with broken windows and a structure falling apart. Memories began to return in flashes, fragments of a story he had tried for a long time to bury. He recognized the place. It was the same gas station where he had stopped the night it all began, many years ago. The memory came like a punch in the gut. The choice the voice was talking about, the mistake he had made, was there, on that same road. Michael forced himself to remember, even though the truth terrified him. That night, a long time ago, he was driving down that same road, hurrying to get out of town and leave everything behind. There was something he was running from, something he didn't want to face. He stopped at the gas station to fill up, and as he entered the store, he encountered a man, a desperate man on the run, who begged for help. Michael, overcome by fear and the urgency of his own escape, refused to help. He had seen the look on that man's face, a look of pure terror, and yet he had left him behind, alone and hopeless, while he himself escaped. Now, standing there, Michael understood the gravity of his choice. The man he had left behind had not survived the night. Something or someone had found him, and he had perished, abandoned and betrayed. And now, years later, fate had collected its debt. His pursuer, the man who had followed him that endless night, was the same person he had abandoned. Somehow, whether through guilt, fate, or something even darker, that man's spirit had returned to settle the score. Michael felt an icy chill run down his spine as he looked around, expecting to see his pursuer appear again. But the road was empty, the fog seemed to be dissipating, and the gas station remained silent, as if it had been waiting for years for his arrival. He fell to his knees, crushed by the weight of guilt and regret. Everything made sense now. The endless road, the endless loop, the relentless pursuit. Everything was a manifestation of his own guilt, his own fear of what he had done. He had fled that city, but had never really escaped the consequences of his choice. As Michael knelt there in the middle of the deserted road, the mist around him began to clear, revealing the bleak vastness of the landscape. He knew there was nowhere left to run. The cycle had closed, and he was finally where he was supposed to be, facing what he had tried to avoid for so long. But contrary to what he had expected, the pursuer didn't appear. There was no longer any need. Michael had understood what he needed to understand. The road he had traveled was not only a real road, but also a path into himself, a journey through the guilt and regret he had tried to bury. Without the strength to continue, Michael lay on the cold asphalt, staring up at the overcast sky. The sound of a distant engine began to approach, but he didn't react. There was no longer any need to run, to flee. He was ready to face whatever came, aware that he had finally reached the end of his journey. The sound of the car approached, and the light from the headlights illuminated Michael's body lying on the road. The last thing he saw was the shadowy figure of his pursuer emerging from the mist, before everything went out again, this time forever. The road was finally empty.